Detective Richard Coleman's weathered hand froze on Bruno's harness, his coffee cup suspended mid-sip as the 800-pound Kodiak bear suddenly erupted into bone-chilling roars that echoed through Miami International Airport's Terminal C. The massive bear clawed frantically at an unmarked black suitcase, his amber eyes wild with desperation Coleman had never witnessed in 8 years of partnership. Passengers scattered like startled birds, their screams piercing the air as security alarms blared. A mother clutched her toddler, stumbling backward as her purse contents scattered across the polished floor. Coleman's throat tightened, remembering Emily's stuffed bear clutched in trembling hands the night she vanished. That same protective fury now blazing in Bruno's eyes. The suitcase had 17 minutes before automatic incineration, but Bruno's primal howls suggested something inside was fighting for every breath. "Lock down the terminal!" Coleman shouted, his voice cracking with urgency he couldn't explain. What was Bruno trying to save? And why did Coleman feel like 8 years of searching was about to end? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Detective Richard Coleman's life had been measured in befores and afters for 8 long years. Before Emily vanished on that October evening in Denver, walking home from her volunteer shift at the Wildlife Rescue Center. After, when the world turned gray and every sunrise felt like a betrayal. At 65, his weathered face told the story of a man who'd aged decades in the span of a single phone call that changed everything. The move to Miami had been desperation disguised as a fresh start. His Denver police pension barely covered the $1,847 monthly Social Security, and Bruno's care cost nearly half of that. They lived in a converted garage behind Margaret O'Sullivan's modest house, where Coleman paid reduced rent in exchange for yard work his arthritic hands could barely manage. Most evenings he ate cereal for dinner so Bruno could have the salmon that kept his massive frame healthy. Bruno wasn't just a bear, he was the miracle that saved Coleman from drowning in grief. Found as an orphaned cub during one of the countless search missions for Emily, the tiny creature had been dying when Coleman discovered him in a drainage culvert. Something in those amber eyes spoke to the broken detective, a shared understanding of loss that transcended species. Against all regulations and common sense, Coleman had taken the cub home, hand-feeding him through those first crucial weeks when neither of them was sure they'd survive. Now, 8 years later, Bruno stood 8 feet tall and weighed 800 pounds of pure muscle and unwavering loyalty. The Miami International Airport security team had initially balked at Coleman's unconventional partner, but Bruno's detection abilities were supernatural. His nose could identify contraband from distances that made trained German shepherds look amateur. More importantly, he possessed an emotional intelligence that made hardened criminals confess just from the weight of his knowing stare. Their daily routine was sacred. Coleman would arrive at Terminal C at 6 a.m. sharp, Bruno's massive paws clicking against the polished floors as they made their rounds. Passengers often stopped to stare, some in terror, others in wonder. Children pressed against windows to wave at the gentle giant who wore a custom-made security vest that read Detection Officer Bruno in bold letters. Margaret O'Sullivan, their 72-year-old landlady, had become Bruno's unofficial grandmother. A widow who worked night shifts as an airport janitor just to stay busy, she'd arrive home each morning with stories of the overnight drama and a bag of Bruno's favorite salmon treats. "That bear's got more sense than most people I know," she'd tell Coleman over their shared morning coffee, her Irish accent still thick after 40 years in America. Dr. Sarah Chen, the airport's chief veterinarian, had become one of the few people Bruno trusted completely. At 34, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd stared down charging elephants and sedated tigers. Her recent divorce had left her working longer hours, finding solace in the animals that never judged or disappointed. James Patterson, their security supervisor, respected Coleman's instincts even when they clashed with protocol. At 58, the former Army sergeant understood that sometimes rules needed bending when lives hung in the balance. In his wallet, Coleman still carried Emily's high school photo, her bright smile frozen in time at 17. Bruno slept each night with Emily's old teddy bear, a connection to the girl they'd both lost and never stopped hoping to find. The morning had started like any other Tuesday at Miami International Airport. Coleman and Bruno arrived at Terminal C precisely at 6 o'clock a.m., their routine as predictable as the sunrise painting the Florida sky in shades of orange and pink. Bruno had been unusually focused during their first sweep, his massive head swiveling with purpose as they navigated through the early morning travelers, clutching coffee cups and dragging wheeled suitcases behind them. It was 2:47 p.m. when everything changed. They were conducting their third sweep of the baggage claim area when Bruno's behavior shifted so dramatically that Coleman's hand instinctively moved to his radio. The bear's usual calm demeanor evaporated as his amber eyes locked onto a single black, hard-shell suitcase circling endlessly on carousel number 4. Bruno's hackles rose along his massive shoulders, and a low growl rumbled from deep in his chest, a sound Coleman had never heard in 8 years of partnership. "Easy, boy," Coleman murmured, but Bruno was beyond responding to commands. The bear's powerful muscles tensed as he approached the carousel, his nose working overtime as he caught a scent that seemed to electrify every nerve in his massive body. When Bruno suddenly reared up on his hind legs and released a roar that shook the terminal windows, Coleman knew they were facing something unprecedented. Passengers scattered in all directions, their screams mixing with the echo of Bruno's distress call. A businessman dropped his laptop, the device clattering across the polished floor as he stumbled backward. A young mother scooped up her toddler, her face pale with terror as she pressed herself against the far wall. Security alarms began blaring throughout the terminal as chaos erupted around the carousel. Coleman's radio crackled to life with urgent voices demanding explanations, but his attention remained fixed on Bruno. The bear was pawing frantically at the carousel's edge, trying to reach the suitcase as it continued its mechanical journey. His behavior was so far outside normal parameters that Coleman felt his chest tighten with a familiar dread, the same instinctual warning he'd ignored the night Emily disappeared. "This is Coleman in Terminal C," he spoke into his radio, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "I need immediate backup at Carousel 4. Bruno's showing extreme alert behavior on an unclaimed suitcase." Within minutes, James Patterson arrived with 2 additional security officers, their faces grim as they took in the scene. Bruno continued his agitated behavior, circling the carousel and releasing intermittent whimpers that sounded almost human in their desperation. The suitcase itself appeared unremarkable, black, hard shell, no identification tags visible, but Bruno's reaction suggested it contained something that triggered every protective instinct in his massive frame. "What's his normal procedure for contraband detection?" Patterson asked, shouting over Bruno's continued vocalizations. "He sits calmly and waits for my command," Coleman replied, his eyes never leaving his partner. "This isn't normal, James. I've never seen him like this." Patterson checked his tablet, scrolling through the baggage manifest with practiced efficiency. "Suitcase has been unclaimed for 71 hours and 43 minutes. Originated in Anchorage, transferred through Vancouver, then Mexico City before arriving here. That's an unusual routing." The mention of Anchorage sent a chill through Coleman's spine. Alaska was Bruno's birthplace, the wilderness where he'd been orphaned before Coleman found him. Could the bear somehow recognize scents from his homeland? The thought seemed impossible, yet Bruno's behavior suggested a connection deeper than routine detection work. "Sir, we need to clear the area," one of the junior officers called out, his voice tight with concern as more passengers gathered to gawk at the massive bear. "The crowd's getting bigger." Coleman nodded, but Bruno refused to move away from the carousel. The bear planted himself directly in front of the suitcase's path, his massive body creating an immovable barrier. When Patterson approached to examine the case more closely, Bruno's growl intensified, his amber eyes never leaving the supervisor's movements. He's protecting it, Coleman realized, the truth hitting him like a physical blow. Not alerting to contraband, he's trying to protect whatever's inside. The automated announcement system echoed through the terminal. Attention passengers, please move away from Carousel 4 while security investigates a potential situation. Your cooperation is appreciated. But Coleman barely heard the words over the thundering of his own heartbeat and Bruno's continued distress signals. Patterson pulled Coleman aside, his expression grave. "Richard, you know I respect your judgment and Bruno's abilities, but we can't shut down an entire terminal based on animal behavior. The suitcase gets incinerated in 16 hours if it remains unclaimed." 16 hours might be too long, Coleman replied, his voice carrying the weight of 8 years of regret. "James, I ignored my instincts once before and it cost me everything. I won't make that mistake again." Bruno's behavior intensified as the suitcase completed another circuit, his massive paws scratching against the polished floor as he tried to intercept it. The bear's distress was palpable, radiating through the terminal like a beacon of desperation that made Coleman's chest ache with familiar pain. Margaret O'Sullivan appeared at Coleman's shoulder, her cleaning cart abandoned as she took in the scene. "That bear's trying to tell you something, Richard," she said, her Irish accent thick with concern. "In all my years, I've never seen an animal carry on like that unless something's terribly wrong." As Bruno released another heart-wrenching howl that echoed through the terminal, Coleman made a decision that would change everything. "James, I'm officially requesting immediate inspection of that suitcase. Whatever's inside, it's running out of time, and so are we." The clock was ticking, and Bruno's desperate warnings grew more urgent with each passing minute. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the security holding area as Coleman paced like a caged animal, his weathered hands clenched into fists. Patterson had denied his request for immediate inspection 3 times in the past hour, citing protocol and liability concerns. Through the reinforced glass window, Coleman could see the black suitcase sitting on a metal shelf, innocent and unremarkable to everyone except Bruno, who pressed his massive frame against the door and whimpered with increasing desperation. 72 hours means 72 hours, Richard," Patterson had said firmly. "I can't authorize opening unclaimed baggage just because your bear is having a bad day. What if it's explosives? What if it's drugs? We follow procedure for a reason." But procedure had never saved Emily. Coleman's mind kept drifting back to that October night 8 years ago when he'd dismissed the gnawing feeling in his gut that something was wrong. Emily had been 20 minutes late coming home from the wildlife center, and he'd convinced himself she was probably just chatting with friends. By the time he called the police, she'd been missing for 3 hours. By the time they found her abandoned backpack near the shipping docks, she'd vanished into thin air. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived at 11:30 p.m., her veterinary bag slung over her shoulder and concern etched across her face. She'd been called in to examine Bruno's unusual behavior, but one look at the bear's frantic state told her everything she needed to know. Bruno was typically calm around strangers, but tonight he barely acknowledged her presence, his entire focus consumed by whatever lay beyond that security door. "How long has he been like this?" Sarah asked, her professional demeanor softening as she watched Bruno's distress. 9 hours and counting, Coleman replied, exhaustion evident in his voice. "He won't eat, won't drink, won't leave this spot." "Doc, I've worked with this bear for 8 years. He's never shown behavior like this." Sarah approached Bruno slowly, her trained eye noting the bear's elevated heart rate, dilated pupils, and the way his massive frame trembled with barely contained energy. When she extended her hand toward him, Bruno briefly nuzzled her palm before returning his attention to the door. His amber eyes filled with an urgency that made her chest tighten. Margaret O'Sullivan wheeled her janitor's cart down the corridor, her shift officially over but her maternal instincts keeping her close to the unfolding drama. At 72, she'd seen enough of life to recognize desperation when she encountered it, and the raw need radiating from Bruno reminded her of her own children's cries when they were too young to articulate their fears. "That poor creature's breaking my heart," Margaret whispered to Coleman. "Whatever's in there, it's calling to him something fierce." As if summoned by their conversation, Dr. Helena Morrison appeared in the corridor, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor with purposeful precision. The renowned wildlife conservationist carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to getting her way, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in an elegant chignon that spoke of boardroom meetings and charity galas. Her foundation's reputation for protecting endangered species preceded her wherever she went. "I came as soon as I heard about the situation," Morrison announced, her cultured voice carrying just the right note of concerned professionalism. "My team is standing by to provide immediate assistance for whatever wildlife might be involved." Coleman's instincts prickled at her sudden appearance. In his experience, legitimate help rarely arrived uninvited, especially not at midnight on a Tuesday. "How did you hear about this?" "We haven't released any information to the public." Morrison's smile was practiced and warm, but something in her eyes remained cold. "I maintain close relationships with airport security nationwide. Wildlife trafficking is unfortunately common, and time is always of the essence in these situations." Bruno's reaction to Morrison was immediate and visceral. The bear's hackles rose along his massive shoulders as a deep growl rumbled from his chest, not the desperate whimpering he'd been making for hours, but something darker and more threatening. His amber eyes fixed on Morrison with unmistakable hostility, his massive frame positioning itself protectively between her and the security door. "Interesting," Sarah murmured, her veterinary training kicking in as she observed Bruno's behavioral shift. "He's been agitated all day, but this is different. This is defensive." Coleman felt the familiar chill of recognition slide down his spine. Bruno's judgment of people had always been flawless. The bear could sense dishonesty and malicious intent with uncanny accuracy. If Bruno didn't trust Morrison, there was a reason, regardless of her sterling reputation in conservation circles. "Dr. Morrison," Coleman said carefully, "I appreciate your concern, but we're still determining what we're dealing with here." Morrison's expression remained pleasantly professional, but her eyes hardened almost imperceptibly. "Detective Coleman, every moment we waste could mean the difference between life and death for endangered animals. Surely you understand the urgency of the situation." The way she emphasized his former title sent another warning signal through Coleman's consciousness. How did she know he'd been a detective? That information wasn't common knowledge among his airport security colleagues. Bruno's growl intensified, his massive body coiled like a spring ready to release 800 pounds of protective fury at a moment's notice. The clock on the security office wall read 2:17 a.m. when Coleman made the decision that would define the rest of his life. Patterson had left for the night. Morrison had departed with promises to return first thing in the morning, and the terminal had settled into the quiet rhythm of red-eye flights and overnight maintenance crews. Only Margaret remained, her cleaning duties long forgotten as she sat vigil with Coleman and the increasingly frantic Bruno. "We can't wait any longer," Coleman whispered, his voice hoarse from hours of arguing with supervisors and fighting his own conscience. "Whatever's in that suitcase, it's running out of time." Sarah Chen nodded grimly, her veterinary bag at the ready. She'd officially signed out hours ago, but something about Bruno's behavior had convinced her to stay. In her 10 years of practice, she'd learned to trust animal instincts over human bureaucracy, and Bruno's desperation spoke of life-and-death urgency that no amount of paperwork could justify ignoring. Margaret pulled out her master key card with trembling fingers. 40 years I've been cleaning up other people's messes, she said, her Irish accent thick with emotion. Tonight, maybe I can help clean up one that actually matters. The security holding area felt different in the dead of night, shadows stretching across the sterile walls like accusing fingers. Bruno pushed past them the moment the door opened, his massive frame moving with surprising grace as he approached the black suitcase. His behavior shifted immediately from frantic to gentle, his enormous paws carefully positioned as he sniffed along the case's edges. "Look at this," Sarah breathed, kneeling beside the suitcase and running her fingers along its seams. "These aren't manufacturing defects. Someone drilled air holes. Tiny ones, barely visible, but deliberately placed for ventilation." Coleman's hand shook as he reached for the latches. 8 years of searching for Emily, 8 years of wondering what if, had led to this moment. Bruno positioned himself protectively beside the case, his amber eyes meeting Coleman's with an intelligence that transcended species barriers. In that gaze, Coleman saw reflected his own desperate hope and bone-deep fear of being too late. The first latch clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through eternity. The second followed, and then Coleman was lifting the lid, his breath catching in his throat as the reality inside hit him like a physical blow. 3 bear cubs, barely 8 weeks old, lay nestled in soiled straw and shredded newspaper. Their breathing was shallow and labored, their tiny bodies so still that for a heart-stopping moment Coleman thought they might already be dead. The smallest cub, a female with distinctive white markings around her muzzle, was barely breathing, her tiny chest rising and falling in desperate, irregular gasps. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, immediately springing into action. Her veterinary training took over as she assessed the cub's condition with practiced efficiency. Severe dehydration, hypothermia, malnutrition. They've been without proper care for days, maybe longer. Bruno's reaction was immediate and profound. The massive Kodiak bear, who could have crushed the cubs with a single swipe of his paw, became impossibly gentle. He lowered his enormous head to sniff each cub carefully, his wet nose barely making contact with their matted fur. A low, mournful sound emerged from deep in his chest. Not a growl or roar, but something that sounded heartbreakingly like a lullaby. Margaret clutched her cleaning supplies with white knuckles, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Sweet Jesus," she breathed. "They're just babies. Who could do such a thing to innocent babies?" Coleman felt his own eyes burning as he gently lifted the smallest cub, her fragile body weighing almost nothing in his calloused hands. The parallel to his own story was impossible to ignore. Another set of helpless innocents ripped from their families, another chance to save what he couldn't save before. "We need to get them medical attention immediately," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah was already preparing emergency IV lines with equipment from her veterinary bag. "The smallest one is critical. Without immediate intervention, she won't survive the next few hours." Her hands moved with practiced precision as she worked to stabilize the cub's vital signs, her professional competence a stark contrast to the tears sliding down her cheeks. Bruno seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. The bear positioned himself as a windbreak, his massive body creating a warm shelter around the cubs while Sarah worked. When the smallest cub let out a pitiful whimper, Bruno responded with the gentlest possible vocalization, a soft, chuffing sound that Coleman had only heard him make in his sleep, usually when dreaming about Emily. "They're Alaskan brown bear cubs," Sarah identified, her voice tight with professional assessment and personal anguish. Probably from Denali National Park, based on their markings. Taking cubs this young from their mother it's essentially a death sentence under normal circumstances. Margaret knelt beside the makeshift medical station, her hands hovering uselessly as she watched Sarah work. "What kind of monster separates babies from their mama?" she whispered. "What kind of world have we made where this happens?" Coleman's mind was racing, connecting dots that painted an increasingly horrifying picture. The unusual shipping route from Alaska through Vancouver and Mexico City. Morrison's convenient appearance and immediate offer of assistance. Bruno's instinctive distrust of the supposed conservationist. The tiny air holes that suggested someone who knew just enough to keep the cubs alive during transport, but didn't care about their suffering. "This isn't random," Coleman said, his detective instincts finally overriding his emotional shock. "Someone ordered these specific cubs. Someone paid enough money to make kidnapping babies from their mother seem worthwhile." Bruno's protective behavior intensified as Sarah continued her medical intervention. The bear seemed to recognize that the cubs needed warmth, and he carefully positioned his massive frame to create a natural heated shelter. His breathing slowed and deepened, radiating calm energy that seemed to soothe the distressed cubs. The largest of the three cubs, a male with distinctive ear markings, began to respond to Sarah's treatment. His breathing became more regular, and his eyes fluttered open to reveal the startling blue irises that would eventually darken to brown as he matured. When he saw Bruno's enormous face hovering protectively overhead, the cub didn't show fear. Instead, he released a tiny mewing sound that spoke of recognition and trust. "It's like he knows Bruno's trying to help," Margaret marveled, her voice filled with wonder, despite the tragic circumstances. Sarah checked her watch, her expression grave. "I've stabilized them for now, but they need specialized equipment and round-the-clock monitoring. The smallest one especially. Her blood sugar is dangerously low, and her body temperature is still dropping." Coleman felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, the same burden he'd carried since Emily's disappearance. These cubs needed an advocate, someone willing to fight the system and ignore bureaucracy in favor of doing what was right. He looked down at the smallest cub in his hands, her white-marked face so peaceful in sleep despite her critical condition. "We need to give them names," he said suddenly, the words surprising him as they emerged. "They're not just evidence or specimens. They're individuals who deserve to be remembered." Sarah paused in her medical work, understanding the symbolic importance of the gesture. "The largest male, let's call him Justice. He's got the strongest chance of survival, and his spirit seems unbroken." Margaret pointed to the medium-sized female, whose striking facial markings made her distinctive. "That one there, with the beautiful patterns around her eyes. She looks like liberty to me, like she's meant to be free." Coleman looked down at the smallest cub, her tiny form so fragile that each breath seemed like a miracle. "Hope," he whispered. "Her name is Hope." Bruno seemed to approve of the naming ceremony, his massive head nodding as if in agreement. The bear had taken on the role of surrogate father with natural grace, his protective instincts now fully engaged in caring for the three orphaned cubs. As dawn approached through the terminal windows, Coleman realized that everything had changed. They were no longer airport security officers dealing with suspicious luggage. They had become the last line of defense for three innocent lives, and the clock was still ticking toward an uncertain future. The morning sun cast harsh shadows through the terminal windows as Dr. Helena Morrison returned with reinforcements. Her team arrived like a military operation. 6 people in matching khaki uniforms bearing the logo of the Morrison Wildlife Foundation, wheeling professional animal transport equipment with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed machine. Behind them walked a man Coleman didn't recognize, tall and imposing in an expensive suit that screamed federal authority. "This is Agent Robert Cross from Fish and Wildlife Services," Morrison announced, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who held all the cards. "He's here to ensure these cubs receive immediate professional care at our facility." Bruno's reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. The massive bear rose to his full 8-foot height, positioning himself protectively over the 3 cubs who had been resting peacefully in the makeshift recovery area Sarah had created. His hackles bristled like steel wool, and a growl rumbled from deep in his chest that made the terminal windows vibrate. Justice, liberty, and hope huddled closer together beneath Bruno's protective stance, their tiny forms dwarfed by his massive presence. Coleman felt his blood pressure spike as he recognized the coordinated nature of Morrison's arrival. "How convenient that you have federal authorization ready at 6 in the morning," he said, his detective instincts screaming warnings. "Most government offices don't open until 9. Agent Cross stepped forward, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Dr. Morrison's foundation has standing agreements with our department for emergency wildlife situations. These cubs need immediate transport to a facility equipped for their specialized care." Sarah Chen stood up from where she'd been monitoring Hope's IV line, her veterinary credentials giving her voice authority that even federal agents had to respect. "These cubs are in critical condition. Moving them now could kill them, especially the smallest one. She needs at least another 12 hours of stabilization before any transport." Morrison's mask of concern slipped just slightly, revealing something colder underneath. "Dr. Chen, while I respect your local veterinary expertise, my team includes specialists who have handled hundreds of endangered bear cubs. Every moment we delay puts these animals at greater risk." Bruno's growl intensified, his amber eyes fixed on Morrison with unmistakable hostility. The bear's judgment had never been wrong in 8 years, and Coleman felt his own suspicions crystallizing into certainty. Something about this entire situation was orchestrated, too convenient, too well prepared. Margaret O'Sullivan had been unusually quiet, but now she stepped forward with the quiet authority of someone who had nothing left to lose. "I've been cleaning these floors for 40 years, she said, her Irish accent thick with indignation. "I've seen every kind of person come through these doors, and I know the difference between someone who helps and someone who takes." The tension in the room ratcheted higher as Morrison's team began unpacking their transport equipment, specialized crates designed for bear cubs, medical monitoring devices, and sedation equipment that looked more suited for large-scale operations than emergency rescue. The efficiency was impressive, but it raised more questions than it answered. "How did you know to bring equipment specifically sized for bear cubs?" Coleman asked, his voice deceptively casual. "The airport hasn't released any information about what we found." Morrison's smile remained perfectly professional, but her eyes hardened. "Detective Coleman, when you've been in wildlife conservation as long as I have, you learn to prepare for every possibility. Trafficking of endangered cubs is unfortunately more common than the public realizes." Agent Cross checked his watch with practiced authority. "We need to move now. My superiors have allocated a narrow window for this operation, and delays could compromise our ability to help these animals." Bruno's protective stance intensified as the transport team approached. The massive bear lowered his head, placing himself directly between the strangers and the cubs. His message was clear. They would have to go through him to reach justice, liberty, and hope. Sarah knelt beside Hope, her hands gentle as she checked the smallest cub's vital signs. "Her heart rate is still dangerously irregular," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. Moving her now would be veterinary malpractice. Coleman watched the exchange with growing certainty that something was deeply wrong. Morrison's team was too prepared, too organized, too ready for this specific situation. In his 30 years as a detective, he'd learned that coincidences were usually conspiracies wearing disguises. "Dr. Morrison," Coleman said, his voice carrying the authority of his former badge. "I'm curious about your foundation's funding sources. Emergency response operations like this must be expensive." For the first time, Morrison's composure cracked slightly. "Our donors prefer to remain anonymous, but I assure you that every dollar goes toward wildlife conservation." Margaret moved closer to Coleman, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I heard her on the phone earlier, talking about buyers and delivery schedules. That's not conservation talk, Richard." The words hit Coleman like electricity. Buyers. Delivery schedules. He looked at the 3 innocent cubs sleeping under Bruno's protection and felt sick to his stomach. These weren't rescue workers. They were the other half of the trafficking operation. Bruno seemed to sense the shift in Coleman's understanding. The bear's eyes met his partner's, and in that moment of connection, Coleman saw 8 years of partnership, trust, and shared purpose crystallized into absolute certainty. Bruno had been trying to warn him from the beginning. "Agent Cross," Coleman said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "I'd like to see your credentials again, along with the official paperwork authorizing this transfer." Cross's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket, a gesture that Coleman recognized from decades of law enforcement. Armed, dangerous, not federal. Sarah must have sensed the changing atmosphere because she suddenly moved to shield Hope's incubator with her body. "I'm not releasing these cubs to anyone without proper veterinary clearance and a complete medical history review," she declared, her voice ringing with professional authority. Morrison's team began closing ranks, their movements coordinated in a way that suggested military or security training rather than wildlife expertise. The transport equipment they'd brought wasn't just professional. It was designed for efficiency over animal welfare, speed over safety. Coleman's radio crackled to life with Patterson's voice. "Coleman, you there? I've got some interesting information about your wildlife expert. Dr. Morrison's foundation has been flagged by Fish and Wildlife for suspicious activities." The morning sun streaming through the windows suddenly felt like a spotlight illuminating the truth. Morrison's perfectly timed arrival, her team's military precision, the specialized equipment, the federal pressure, all of it orchestrated to steal 3 innocent cubs from the people trying to save them. Bruno positioned himself more protectively over the cubs, his massive frame coiled like a spring ready to unleash 800 pounds of protective fury. His amber eyes never left Morrison's team, tracking their every movement with the intensity of a predator defending his young. The confrontation Coleman had been dreading was about to begin, and this time he wouldn't be too late to save the innocents who needed him most. The confrontation erupted with the sudden violence of a summer storm. Morrison's perfectly composed facade shattered the moment she realized her deception had been exposed, her cultured voice dropping to a cold snarl as she barked orders to her team. "Secure the cubs now. Use whatever force is necessary." Bruno's response was immediate and terrifying. The massive Kodiak bear rose to his full height, 8 feet of pure protective fury, as a roar erupted from his chest that made the terminal windows shake. His amber eyes blazed with primal rage as he positioned himself over justice, liberty, and hope, his massive paws spread wide to shield them from the approaching threat. Coleman drew his service weapon, muscle memory from 30 years of police work taking over as adrenaline flooded his system. "Everyone step back!" he shouted, his voice cracking with the strain of the moment. "Bruno, protect them!" The bear needed no further encouragement. When the first member of Morrison's team tried to dart Bruno with a tranquilizer gun, the massive animal moved with surprising speed, his powerful swipe sending the weapon flying across the terminal floor. The man stumbled backward, terror replacing professional confidence as he faced 800 pounds of enraged protective instinct. Sarah Chen threw herself over Hope's incubator, her body creating a human shield around the smallest cub who was still fighting for every breath. "You're not taking them!" she screamed, her veterinary training warring with maternal instinct as she clutched the tiny bear to her chest. Margaret O'Sullivan surprised everyone by grabbing her mop bucket and hurling the dirty water at Agent Cross, who was reaching for what Coleman now realized was probably not a federal badge, but a weapon. The elderly Irish woman's aim was perfect, catching the fake agent in the face and sending him stumbling backward with a curse that definitely wasn't government-issued. 40 years of cleaning up messes," Margaret shouted, "and now I'm making one for the right reasons." The terminal erupted into chaos as Morrison's team revealed their true nature. These weren't wildlife conservationists or federal agents. They were professional criminals who had built an elaborate cover story around their trafficking operation. Coleman watched in horror as they pulled out restraining equipment designed not for animal welfare but for forcible capture. Bruno fought like the wild animal he truly was, his massive frame moving with deadly grace as he kept the attackers away from the cubs. When one of Morrison's men tried to slip around behind him, Bruno's backhand swipe sent the man flying into a row of chairs with bone-crushing force. The bear's protective instincts had transformed him into something primordial and unstoppable. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," Morrison screamed at Coleman, her mask of respectability completely gone. "These cubs are worth $500,000 each to private collectors. Do you have any idea what kind of people you're stealing from?" Coleman felt his rage crystallize into something cold and focused. "The same kind of people who steal children from their families," he replied, thinking of Emily's face and the 8 years of searching that had led to this moment. "The same kind of monsters who profit from innocence." The battle continued to rage around them as Bruno held his ground, his massive body an unmovable barrier between the cubs and their would-be captors. Justice and liberty had awakened during the chaos, their tiny voices joining in distressed cries that seemed to fuel Bruno's protective fury. But hope remained dangerously still in Sarah's arms, her breathing growing more labored with each passing moment. Sarah looked up from the smallest cub with tears streaming down her face. "She's going into cardiac arrest," she screamed over the chaos. "The stress is killing her." Coleman felt his world narrow to that single moment, Hope's tiny body fighting for life while evil men tried to steal her away to a fate worse than death. Bruno seemed to sense the crisis too, his roars taking on a note of desperate anguish that spoke of understanding beyond animal instinct. Morrison's team was regrouping, their professional training beginning to overwhelm the element of surprise that had given Coleman and his allies their initial advantage. More equipment was being unpacked, heavier restraints, more powerful tranquilizers designed to bring down something as large as Bruno. The massive bear stood panting over the cubs, his amber eyes meeting Coleman's one final time. In that gaze, Coleman saw reflected his own determination to save what could be saved, to protect what mattered most, regardless of the cost. The final battle for 3 innocent lives was about to begin. Hope's tiny heart stopped beating at 3:17 a.m., her fragile body finally succumbing to the trauma and stress that no 8-week-old cub should ever have endured. Sarah Chen's desperate attempts at resuscitation echoed through the terminal as she performed CPR on the smallest bear, her tears falling onto the cub's motionless form while the chaos of the confrontation raged around them. "Come on, baby," Sarah whispered between compressions, her veterinary training warring with the crushing weight of failure. "Don't give up. Please don't give up." But Hope's spirit had already departed, leaving behind only the shell of what could have been, a life cut short by human greed and the merchandise mentality that reduced magnificent creatures to dollar signs. Coleman felt his knees buckle as he watched Sarah finally stop her efforts, the terrible stillness of death settling over the tiny cub like a shroud. Bruno's anguished howl when he realized Hope was gone would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. The massive bear's protective fury transformed into something deeper and more primal. Grief that transcended species barriers and spoke to the universal pain of losing the innocent. His massive frame shook with sobs that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, and for a moment even Morrison's team stopped their assault to witness the raw emotion of a creature mourning a life he couldn't save. Margaret O'Sullivan collapsed into a chair, her weathered hands pressed to her mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered, "that little angel fought so hard. She deserved so much better than this cruel world gave her." The death of Hope changed everything. What had been a confrontation over trafficking suddenly became something far more personal and devastating. Coleman stared down at the tiny body in Sarah's arms and saw not just a bear cub, but a symbol of every innocent life lost to greed, every child who never made it home, every battle that ended in heartbreak despite the best intentions. "You killed her," Coleman said to Morrison, his voice hollow with grief and rage. "Your greed, your trafficking network, your complete disregard for life. You murdered an innocent baby." Morrison's response revealed the true depths of her callousness. "Casualties are inevitable in any business venture," she replied coldly, already calculating the loss. "The 2 remaining cubs are still worth a substantial sum, and the buyers won't miss one weak animal." Her words hit the room like physical blows. Sarah clutched Hope's body tighter, her veterinary oath to first do no harm mocking her in the face of such casual cruelty. Bruno's grief transformed back into protective rage as he positioned himself over justice and liberty with renewed determination, his amber eyes promising death to anyone who tried to take the surviving cubs. The battle resumed with even greater intensity, but now it carried the weight of Hope's sacrifice. Coleman fought with the desperation of a man who had already lost too much, his service weapon trained on Morrison's team as they attempted to regroup and complete their mission. The stakes had become personal in the most devastating way possible. Morrison pulled out her phone and made a call that chilled Coleman's blood. "The package has been compromised," she said into the device. "We need immediate extraction and cleanup. Yes, eliminate any witnesses." The implication was clear. They were all marked for death. Morrison's operation was too valuable, too connected, too powerful to allow loose ends like heroic airport security guards and veterinarians to expose their network. Coleman realized with crystalline clarity that they weren't just fighting to save justice and liberty anymore, they were fighting for their own lives. Bruno seemed to understand the escalation. The massive bear's protective instincts expanded to include not just the cubs, but all of his human family. When one of Morrison's reinforcements tried to flank their position, Bruno moved with lethal precision, his massive paw connecting with the man's chest and sending him crashing into a wall with enough force to crack concrete. Sarah continued to hold Hope's body, unwilling to let go of the tiny life that had slipped away despite their best efforts. "She was going to be beautiful," she whispered to Coleman during a brief lull in the fighting. "Look at her face, so peaceful now. She's finally free from pain." Margaret had found a surprising reserve of strength in her grief, using her knowledge of the terminal's layout to help coordinate their defense. "There's another way out through the maintenance tunnels," she told Coleman. "If we can get the cubs to the veterinary clinic in the secure area, they'll have to go through multiple checkpoints to reach us." But moving justice and liberty meant leaving Hope behind, and none of them could bear the thought of abandoning the tiny cub who had fought so bravely for life. Bruno seemed to understand their dilemma, gently nuzzling Hope's still form with his massive snout before carefully picking up Justice in his mouth, his bite gentle enough to hold an egg without breaking it. The surviving male cub seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, remaining perfectly still in Bruno's protective grip while Liberty pressed close to Coleman's legs, seeking comfort from the human who had named her for the freedom she might never experience. As they prepared to make their desperate escape through Margaret's maintenance tunnels, Coleman took one last look at Hope's peaceful face. "I'm sorry we couldn't save you, little one," he whispered, "but I promise your death won't be meaningless. We'll make them pay for what they did to you." Morrison's voice echoed behind them as they entered the tunnel system, her cultured tones now revealing the monster beneath the philanthropist's mask. "You can run, but you can't hide forever. My organization has resources you can't imagine, and these cubs represent too much money to simply write off as a loss." The underground tunnels beneath Miami International Airport became their sanctuary and their prison, a labyrinth of service corridors and utility spaces where the sound of Hope's final breath seemed to echo endlessly. Bruno carried justice with infinite gentleness, while Liberty walked between Coleman and Sarah, the three survivors bound together by grief and determination. Behind them, they could hear Morrison's team regrouping, their pursuit relentless and professional. The wildlife trafficking network that had killed Hope was vast, well-funded, and utterly without conscience. Coleman knew that even if they escaped the immediate threat, Morrison's organization would never stop hunting them. But as they moved through the darkness with their precious cargo of surviving cubs, Coleman felt something he hadn't experienced since Emily's disappearance, the absolute certainty that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. Hope's death had crystallized everything. Innocence deserved protection, evil deserved justice, and love was stronger than any trafficking network's resources. In the tunnels beneath the airport, carrying two orphaned bear cubs while pursued by killers, Coleman finally understood what Bruno had been trying to tell him from the beginning. Sometimes saving what matters most requires risking everything else, and sometimes the greatest victories come from the smallest acts of defiance against cruelty. Hope's spirit seemed to guide them through the darkness, her brief life becoming a beacon of purpose that would sustain them through whatever came next. The tiny cub who had died in their arms had given them something invaluable, the absolute moral clarity that would either save them all or ensure their deaths had meaning. The war for justice and Liberty's lives was far from over, but Hope's sacrifice had transformed it into something sacred. The truth began unraveling in the sterile brightness of the airport's emergency command center, where Coleman and his unlikely family of survivors had finally found temporary sanctuary behind reinforced doors and federal protection. Real federal agents, legitimate fish and wildlife officers led by Agent Maria Santos, had arrived after Margaret's desperate 911 call, and their investigation into Morrison's credentials had opened a Pandora's box of corruption that stretched across international borders. Dr. Sarah Chen was not who she claimed to be. As she gently cradled justice while monitoring Liberty's recovery, she looked up at Coleman with eyes that held secrets 8 years in the making. "My real name is Sarah Morrison Chen," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of a truth she'd hidden for too long. "Helena Morrison is my mother." The revelation hit Coleman like a physical blow. The veterinarian who had fought so desperately to save the cubs, who had held Hope as she died, who had risked everything to protect innocent lives, she was the daughter of the woman who had orchestrated their suffering. "I've been undercover for 3 years," Sarah continued, tears streaming down her face as Justice nuzzled against her shoulder. "Fish and Wildlife placed me here to investigate my mother's trafficking network. She doesn't know who I really am. I've been using my ex-husband's name and credentials." Bruno's reaction to this revelation was immediate but surprising. Instead of the hostility he'd shown toward Morrison, the massive bear moved closer to Sarah, his amber eyes filled with what could only be described as understanding. The bear's emotional intelligence had somehow sensed her true allegiance all along. Agent Santos leaned forward, her expression grave. "What we've uncovered is staggering. Morrison's foundation is a front for one of the largest wildlife trafficking operations in North America. But that's not all. Her network has connections to human trafficking rings throughout Southeast Asia. Coleman's blood turned to ice. Human trafficking? Sarah nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. 8 years ago, my mother's operation was smaller, more focused on exotic animals. But they also dealt in other merchandise. Richard, I've been tracking missing persons cases connected to her network, and there's a file on a girl named Emily Carter from Denver. The world stopped. Coleman felt as if he were falling through space and time, 8 years of searching and hoping and grieving crystallizing into a single moment of impossible possibility. Emily, he breathed. You found something about Emily? Margaret O'Sullivan gasped, her weathered hands flying to her mouth. In the days they'd spent together, Coleman had shared his daughter's story, and the elderly woman had become emotionally invested in his quest for answers. Agent Santos pulled out a tablet and showed Coleman a photograph that made his knees buckle. It was Emily, older, changed, but unmistakably his daughter, standing in what appeared to be a rescue facility in Thailand. This was taken 2 months ago at a rehabilitation center in Bangkok, Santos explained. She was rescued from a trafficking ring that has documented connections to Morrison's network. Coleman's hands shook as he reached for the tablet, studying every pixel of his daughter's face. She was 23 now, no longer the teenager who had vanished from his world, but her eyes were the same, Emily's eyes, alive and real and looking back at him across 8 years of heartbreak. She's been in recovery for 6 months, Sarah added gently. The rehabilitation process for trafficking survivors is complex, but she's making progress. Richard, she's alive. Your daughter is alive. Bruno seemed to sense the monumental shift in the room's emotional atmosphere. The massive bear, who had been keeping vigilant watch over justice and liberty, suddenly focused his attention on Coleman with an intensity that was almost supernatural. The bear's amber eyes held recognition, understanding, and something that looked remarkably like hope. "There's more," Sarah continued, her voice breaking with emotion. "Emily remembers you, remembers Denver. She's been asking about her father with the bear. Richard, she never forgot you or Bruno." The connection hit Coleman like lightning. Bruno's unusual attachment to the cubs, his desperate need to save them, his unwavering loyalty despite 8 years of separation from his original purpose, the bear had been searching for Emily too, protecting other innocents as a way of honoring the girl they couldn't save in time. Agent Santos activated a secure video connection, and suddenly Emily's face filled the screen. She was thinner than Coleman remembered, marked by experiences no parent ever wants to imagine their child enduring, but she was unmistakably his daughter. When she saw Coleman's face on the screen, her composed expression crumbled into tears of recognition and relief. "Dad?" Emily's voice was older, stronger, but still his little girl. "Is that really you? And is Bruno there?" Coleman couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at the miracle of his daughter's face. Bruno, however, reacted immediately. The massive bear's head shot up, his ears pricking forward as he heard the voice that had haunted his dreams for 8 years. A sound emerged from deep in his chest, not a roar or growl, but a gentle chuffing noise that Coleman had only heard in Bruno's sleep. "Bruno recognizes her voice," Margaret whispered in amazement. "After all these years, he still knows his girl." Emily laughed through her tears, a sound that healed something fundamental in Coleman's soul. "I can hear him," she said. "I never forgot that sound. Dad, I never forgot either of you." Sarah wiped her own tears as she continued to monitor the cubs. "Emily's recovery has been remarkable. She's been helping at the rehabilitation center, working with trafficked animals. She says it helps her heal, caring for creatures who've survived what she survived. The parallel was impossible to ignore. Emily caring for trafficked animals while Coleman and Bruno rescued trafficked cubs. Love had found a way to connect them across continents and years, expressing itself through the protection of innocents who couldn't protect themselves. Justice mewed softly in Sarah's arms, his tiny voice joining the conversation like a bridge between past and present. Liberty padded over to Coleman and gently nuzzled his hand, as if offering comfort for pain she couldn't understand, but somehow sensed. "When can she come home?" Coleman asked, his voice hoarse with 8 years of suppressed emotion. "Soon," Agent Santos promised. "The legal process is complex, but we're expediting everything. Helena Morrison's arrest has broken open several trafficking networks, and Emily's testimony will be crucial in ensuring these operations never hurt anyone again." As they spoke, Bruno continued to listen to Emily's voice with an attention that transcended normal animal behavior. 8 years of waiting. 8 years of protecting other innocents in her absence, and finally, the reunion that had seemed impossible was within reach. Hope's death had been the catalyst. But love was the force that would ultimately triumph over the darkness that had separated this family for far too long. 6 months later, the Colorado mountains painted themselves in autumn gold, as 3 generations gathered around a dinner table that had been empty for far too long. Emily Carter Coleman sat between her father and her newborn daughter, Hope Elizabeth, while Bruno dozed contentedly by the fireplace, his massive frame finally at peace after 8 years of searching. The bear who had saved 3 cubs and helped reunite a family now served as gentle guardian to the newest member of their unconventional household. The rehabilitation center Emily had established in Hope's memory was thriving, providing sanctuary for both trafficked animals and human survivors of trafficking networks. Justice and Liberty, now healthy young bears, roamed freely in the center's expansive enclosures, their playful antics bringing joy to visitors who came to learn about conservation and the ongoing fight against wildlife crime. Dr. Helena Morrison had been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, her trafficking empire dismantled piece by piece through Emily's testimony and evidence gathered during the airport confrontation. The trial had been difficult for Emily, facing the woman whose network had stolen 8 years of her life, but she'd found strength in knowing that her courage would prevent countless other families from experiencing similar heartbreak. Sarah Morrison Chen had legally changed her name to Sarah Chen Carter, choosing to honor the family who had shown her what true love looked like rather than the woman who had brought so much darkness into the world. She'd become Emily's closest friend and confidant, their shared understanding of trauma and healing creating a bond that transcended their unusual introduction. Margaret O'Sullivan had moved to Colorado to be closer to the family she'd helped save, her Irish wisdom and maternal warmth filling the grandmother role that baby Hope Elizabeth would need as she grew. The 73-year-old former janitor now managed the day-to-day operations of Emily's rehabilitation center, her organizational skills and fierce protective instincts making her invaluable to their mission. Coleman had officially retired from all law enforcement duties, choosing instead to focus on his roles as father, grandfather, and advocate for missing persons and trafficking survivors. His pension was modest, but Emily's rehabilitation center provided enough income for their simple mountain lifestyle, and more importantly, it gave their family a shared purpose that honored Hope's memory while building something beautiful from their collective trauma. The evening routine had become sacred to all of them. After dinner, Coleman would read to baby Hope Elizabeth while Emily worked on her doctoral dissertation in wildlife conservation, and Sarah reviewed medical files for incoming animals. Bruno would position himself protectively near the baby's crib. his massive presence a gentle reminder that love came in many forms and that family was defined by loyalty rather than species. "Do you think she knows?" Emily asked one evening, watching Bruno's careful interaction with her daughter. "Do you think she understands that Bruno saved more than just those cubs?" Coleman smiled, his weathered face showing lines of contentment rather than the grief that had marked him for so long. "I think animals understand things we're still learning about. Bruno spent 8 years protecting innocence because he couldn't protect you. Now he can protect Hope Elizabeth and watch her grow up safe and loved." The mountains outside their window stood eternal and strong, witness to the healing that had taken place within their walls. The rehabilitation center's lights twinkled in the valley below, each illuminated window representing another life being restored, another creature finding sanctuary after surviving humanity's darkest impulses. Emily had insisted on naming her daughter Hope Elizabeth as a tribute to the tiny bear cub whose death had catalyzed their reunion. "Hope gave her life so that justice and liberty could live," she'd explained during the christening ceremony attended by their extended family of survivors and healers. "And in a way, she gave us our lives back too." Bruno's transformation from detection officer to family guardian had been seamless, his protective instincts now focused on the growing baby who gurgled happily whenever the massive bear approached her crib. The bear's gentleness with Hope Elizabeth was extraordinary. He could pick up her dropped toys with the same delicate precision he'd once used to carry justice to safety. The rehabilitation center's success had attracted national attention, drawing visitors from across the country who wanted to learn about Emily's innovative approach to treating trauma in both animals and humans. Her integration of wildlife therapy with traditional counseling methods was proving remarkably effective, helping survivors reclaim their sense of agency and purpose through caring for creatures who had endured similar exploitation. On quiet evenings, Coleman would sit on the porch with Bruno, both of them watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of hope and remembrance. The bear would rest his massive head on Coleman's lap, and the retired detective would stroke the familiar fur while reflecting on the journey that had brought them home. "You never gave up, did you, boy?" Coleman would whisper. 8 years of waiting, and you never stopped believing we'd find her." Bruno's response was always the same, a gentle, chuffing sound that spoke of contentment, loyalty, and love that transcended the barriers between species. The bear, who had detected more than contraband, who had sensed the presence of innocence in need and refused to be ignored, had finally completed his most important mission. As winter approached, their first Christmas together as a complete family loomed ahead, filled with the promise of new traditions and the gentle healing that came with time and love. Emily was planning to return to Thailand in the spring to help other rehabilitation centers implement her methods, but she would return home to Colorado, to the family that would always be waiting for her. The little cub named Hope had lived only briefly, but her legacy continued in the center that bore her name, in the family she'd helped reunite, and in the countless lives that would be saved because 3 people and 1 extraordinary bear had refused to look away from suffering. In the end, love had proven stronger than greed, family bonds had transcended 8 years of separation, and hope had been reborn in the mountains of Colorado, where 3 generations now gathered each evening to share stories, laughter, and the profound gratitude that came from being given a second chance at happiness. Have you ever experienced the power of unconditional love that transcends all understanding, whether from a family member, friend, or even a beloved pet who seemed to know exactly what you needed during your darkest moments? After 8 years of separation, Detective Coleman's reunion with his daughter Emily reminds us that some bonds can never truly be broken, and that love finds a way to guide us home even when hope seems lost. In our golden years, We understand better than anyone that family isn't just about blood. It's about who shows up when everything falls apart, who fights for you when you can't fight for yourself, and who never stops believing in the possibility of miracles. What moment in your life reminded you that love really does conquer all? Share your story of unexpected hope or an animal companion who changed your life. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.